when we add a fluid to the system. And this is basically the result of this experiment. So everything is exactly the same number of beats, same deformation, everything is exactly the same. But in this case, all the pore space is filled with oil. And I don't think it needs much convincing that these two experiments look fundamentally different, right? I mean, clearly, all the beats experience a lot more stress. They're way brighter. The patterns are totally crazy. But to really quantify that, we decided to look at the orientation of individual force chains. And that's what we've done here. So we took our experiments, we traced the orientation of all these little bright lines, and we were plotting them in rows diagram. So the top two are again the experiments at low strain and higher strain, just with grains. And the bottom ones are those that have the fluid. What we're seeing in the dry case is that, well, the overall average orientation of the force chains, which is the black line, is more or less parallel to the orientation of sigma 1 for maximum stress direction, which are the two areas. Now, if we have a fluid in our experiment, what we're seeing is that at low strains, the average orientation of the force chains is almost parallel to the shear plane. And then again, with increased strain, it starts rotating and become more parallel to our sigma 1 direction. So we were, I mean, that was kind of interesting, but we were like thinking like, okay, what does that actually mean? And to better understand this, we were zooming in and looked at how individual force chains look. So the top picture again is the granular experiment. The bottom two pictures, the one with fluid. And if we focus on this one grain that is circled, this behaves exactly as expected. So a grain that has only one neighbor, we would expect to not be able to support any force. And this is indeed happening here because this guy here is not lighting up, so it's not supporting anything. The picture on the right is simply a synthetic image where we calculate how much forces are in the individual beats. And again, the beat circle has no force, whether we calculate it or we just observe it in the experiment. This is in big contrast to when we have a fluid present in the experiment. This guy down here, also circled, again has only one neighbor. So this is the neighbor here. All the other beats are not touching. But in comparison to the dry case, now we have a fluid sitting in the space around it. And clearly, this bead here is supporting forces because it's dry. And again, this also works when we are actually looking at the calculated forces. So what we're seeing is that over a limited amount of time, eventually it will relax, but over a limited amount of time, the fluid is able to exert a force onto the brittle face. The light is coming from compression. So all these beads are laying on a table. Light is coming through the beads in a polariscope. So it's polarized light. Everything that remains dark is unstressed, and everything that has is lighting up is under stress. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
You can also have shear stress, but that's not so well understood, right? If it's lit up, it could have some combination of
It can. It's mostly normal stress because if you have too much shear stress, this bead would instantly rearrange and roll and get a new configuration of the force network. All right. So at this point, so far we've done all these experiments where we used a linear viscous fluid in between the grains. So we thought like, well, maybe, you know, it would be kind of linear viscosity is always a big simplification that sometimes people don't really like. And so we thought like, well, it would be neat if we could test if we can also transfer stresses from the fluid onto the solid phase if we have nonlinear fluid. And to do this, we were doing some quite simple two-dimensional finite element models. And this is just the overall model setup. So we have a matrix which has a bunch of these circles that are a lot stronger than the matrix. So everything is a fluid in this case, but they have a lot higher viscosity. that are sitting in this matrix. We apply shear deformation, and we're simply going to monitor what happens with these beads. We were testing a bunch of different viscosities and different viscosities and different rheological descriptions of the matrix to see what's going to happen. And this is what we found. So we tried two constant viscosities. So it's just a constant viscosity. One that's relatively weak and one that's a bit higher. And when we look at the results, the first column is the viscous strain in the matrix. The second column is the plastic strain in the beads. And then the third column is the second invariant in the shear strength. And what we saw is that, well, for a low viscosity, we have almost no plastic strain in the beads. But for a higher viscosity of the matrix, you now start seeing a plastic strain within the individual beads. So again, constant viscosity is probably not most realistic in natural systems. So we were like, okay, well, let's take the flow law of a granite. Why not? And let's see what happens here. We did 3 experiments with a flow law of granite, where in one case, we made the flow law artificially weaker. Then this is the one that's actually published. And then in one case, we made the flow law artificially stronger. And very similar to the constant viscosity experiment, we saw that if we have a high enough viscosity of the matrix, we can actually transfer some of the forces onto the beads, and if they start lighting up, the plastic strain starts showing up in individual beads. So if we zoom in on just the 2 interesting experiments, this is the experiment for constant viscosity, and this is the experiment for a modified granitic power law rheology for the matrix. And in both cases, we were able to get the beads to actually deform without touching each other. So far, we've hopefully seen that the presence of the fluid has an impact on the stick-slip signal, and that if we have a fluid present, we're going to change the distribution of the forces in our system, and the fluid is able to support part of this force over at least a limited amount of time. We also saw that the exact rheology of the fluid seems to not play that big of an impact as long as the viscosity is high enough. So we can transfer the stresses from the fluid onto the solid. However, the problem with all these approaches is that they're only purely 2D. So the models are 2D, the experiments are 2D, but most importantly, the brittle phase cannot break. So in comparison to what we saw at the very beginning of the field examples, where we saw all these different fractures, any of these different approaches could actually simulate the failure of the brittle class. And so to change this, we decided to use a different experimental apparatus. So we're using this donut-shaped ring shear device, where Kimberly was mentioning this project about science communication. So this is one of the outcomes that one of these illustrated matches were a drawing of our experimental setup. And I'm fortunate to be able to use this because I cannot produce anything that's even halfway as beautiful as this. But it illustrates basically the setup of the machine, where we have the experimental chamber here in the middle. We have a circular motor that runs around the chamber. We can again have this link with a spring to a force gauge, so we can again measure everything between sticks with the stick. We have a lid that's going to be able to impose a constant normal force on the experiment, and well, we can turn this as many times as we want. The one thing that's in addition to this actual shear deformation apparatus is that in this case, we are going to use 2 materials that are light index refraction matched. So we're using the hydro beads and the hydrogel that are basically very similar and can't be distinguished by looking at it. But if they're illuminated by a laser sheet, we start seeing their small differences and can basically have sections through the experiment while it. So as mentioned, these are some examples of the experimental materials we're using. So we're using hydro orbs of various sizes. We're using some cubes that can be cut to whatever you like. And the thing that's important to us is that any of these materials are able to fracture. So they're elastic to a certain degree, and once the yield is overcome, they're going to fracture into small pieces. That's the fluid-like phase that we're going to use as the second phase. And as mentioned, if you look at it just with the naked eye, you can't really distinguish the two phases. But if we illuminate it with a laser sheet, clearly we can see the individual hydroorbs that are swimming in this matrix, or in this case, the individual cubes. Now, this is just an example made a long time ago, just with a phone camera, of how this looks while it deforms. So we have a laser sheet coming from the left, from the right, shines into basically the experimental chamber. Motion is through the screen towards us, and we see individual hydroorbs moving in and out of the illuminated plane. So when we look at experiments where we have these hydroorbs, the thing that we really were interested in is, can we get individual orbs to fail while we apply deformation? And I don't know why this video does not want to work, but let's just see. Oh, it's working. Yes. So of course, I would like you to focus on this one orb that's circled here. And I think we could agree that it's fractured, right? So we see it moves through the laser sheet towards us. So we're looking at 4 consecutive sections, basically, all including this one orb that's fractured here. So it has, even though it's close to the wall, but it doesn't have any neighbors that it's in touch with. So it's not part of any kind of load-bearing force chain, but it's just one guy hanging out in a matrix of shell that is fluid-like, and nonetheless it's fractured. So of course one could say, well, this is probably a fluke. So we rerun these experiments multiple times. We started varying the percentage of beads that are in the experiment. On the right, we have 64% of beads, the rest by volume, the rest is the fluid. And on the left, we have 32% by volume of beads, and the rest is again fluid. And in both cases, we see individual grains that are fractured. We see some fragments of individual clasts. And then one thing that we didn't really count on, that just happened to be the case, we can also start seeing the actual viscous deformation in the fluid by having some kind of streamlines that start forming when we continuously shear. This is simply due to sometimes these materials start growing mold if it's not cold enough, and so you can start basically shearing mold. That was not an intentional thing, that just happened, but it was kind of like an interesting, little piece of evidence to see the viscous deformation in the fluid. Now, if we would like to better understand what's going on with the dynamics of these systems, it probably would make sense to have a look at an experiment where we only deform the beads, and an experiment where we only deform the fluid, to just make sure we actually understand what this middle case is truly doing. So one of the problems is that in all these experiments, the only thing, again, we can measure is the bulk force. So here we have 3 snippets of some of this force data. They're each just a minute long, but this is from the brittle experiment with only the beads, the one where we have the beads and the fluid, and the one that's only the fluid. And what we're seeing is that the black line is the actual raw data. The red line is a filtered version of that data. And what we decided to look at is the variance in the data. So how much different is a filtered version of your data that is trying to get rid of most of the machine noise with respect to the actual brittle, the actual signal that we record. And what we're observing is that in the brittle case, so these are all the blue dots, we see, first of all, a lot higher variance than in the 2 other experiments. And we also see the variance decreasing over time. And this decrease is linked with the number of beads that are breaking through. So this is in itself interesting if you're interested in brittle deformation. But the thing that really interested us was what's going on with the red and the black dots down here. So the red ones are coming from the semi-brittle experiment. In this case, there are 64% by volume of grains in this experiment, the rest is fluid. And the black dots are coming from the experiment we just did. And looking at these, that's basically the same. So we don't really see any difference in the variance between a case where we have the grains and the case where we do have no grains, which to us that was fairly surprising, because looking back at this slide, we clearly see that some of these grains are breaking, but that seems to be not something that we can actually record with our bulk measurements that we currently obtaining in these experiments. So by now we know, okay, we can get beads to actually break without touching other beads, but just by forces that are transferred from the fluid onto the fluid. But and we also saw that we have a bulk measurement that's really similar between the semi-brittle case and the purely viscous case, indicating that the fluid phase has a really big impact on the bulk force measurement. We have, however, no way currently to localize or to measure localized breaking of these individual beads. We know it's happening, we can see it's happening, but we can't measure. So this is where this is all brand new and it's not finished, but I'm going to show you anyway because I think it's fun. But so this remains to all be tested in detail. But the idea was like, well, maybe we could try to actually listen to individual beads breaking. And for this to happen, we had to first figure out, is it even possible to hear something break that's so slippery, gooey, and not necessarily very brittle? The good news is that, yes, it is doable. So what you're seeing here is this is a teeny tiny hydrophone, basically, that we just shove into this bead, into this hydro orb. And what's happening is it's producing a fracture. And while we're shoving this into this orb, we're recording what this hydrophone basically hears. And these are some of these signals that we can record. So we have time on the x-axis, it's just an offset amplitude on the y-axis. And the first signal that comes in is this one here, the blue one. So we clearly get a signal from the initiation of, followed by a whole bunch of more smaller signals that are basically being produced while this fracture is propagating through this bead. So this was really encouraging because this at least is like a proof of concept that theoretically we can listen to individual beads breaking. However, we need to also test this in some sort of an experimental setup. Now, because the ring shear is of course in itself already fraught with lots of noise that's coming from the rotation, we decided to set up a super simple experiment. So we just have a cylinder where we can fill in about 50 of these hydro orbs. It has a lid and we just apply a constant load on it. And we are listening on the outside of the cylinder with 6 different sensors to see if we can hear anything. And we place 2 hydro orbs with little hydrophone sensors within into the experiment. And this is what we can observe. So we get 2 different types of signals. One is this one here. So this looks fairly similar to this very first example of like the actual breaking of the bead. We have again time on the x-axis. The green signal is recorded within one of these tiny hydrophones that are in one of these orbs within the experiment. And the yellow signal is recorded on the outside. And no big surprise, of course, the signal recorded on the outside is a lot smaller because the waves need to travel through the container that contains the experiment, but they are here at the same time, so that seems to be all working pretty nicely. And we would interpret this as the actual fracturing of a hydro orb within. So this is what we were hoping to be able to record. This one over here was surprising, but I think quite exciting. So again, we have the time on the x-axis, and looking at this signal here, it has a way longer wavelength than anything we recorded on the left. And what we currently are interpreting this to be is basically the rearranging of beads within the experimental setup. So that this is not the signal from any breaking, but it's the signal from these individual orbs having to move past each other when we apply a load to the setup. So this is all pretty exciting, and I think it opens the door to actually for us to be able to monitor fracturing of individual beads through using basically acoustic emission monitoring, so we can address the shortcoming of having only bulk force measurements with measurements, adding the acoustic emission measurements to it. But as said, this is all very in its baby shoes, and this is as far as we are at the moment. So no concluding remarks on this. So some of you now maybe think like, yeah, all right, whatever. This is all just gel and plastics. Maybe this is not the audience that would say that. But when I talk to geologists, this is normally the response I get. It's like, yeah, you start with rocks and then you just show us a bunch of gel and plastic experiments. So what can we do about it? And this is where scaling comes in. And this is how I connected with Chris Paola on all these scaling issues. And I think a good example about scaling is talking about toy cars. So we all have pretty intuitively, we've all played probably with toy cars at some point, or at least seen them. I think it's fairly fair to say that toy cars are a pretty good representation of how an actual car looks. So they're scaled pretty accurately with respect to their dimensions and how they look. Where the scaling fails entirely is when it comes to strength. So if you take a toy car and you smash it from a meter onto the floor, nothing's going to happen. But if you take a real car, and let's say this is 50 times larger than this one, and you let this one drop from 50 meters height, you're never going to drive it again. So it illustrates nicely that scaling is always, you have to make choices. In this case, the toy car manufacturer chose to scale these little cars with respect to shape and size. But they did not scale it with respect to strength, because that would not be very practical. So this means that whatever we do, we're faced with choice. What's happening? Can I not advance anymore? Let's see. Here we are. Okay, perfect. So Chris once published this really nice hierarchy of experiments, where it basically talks about the uncertainty of extrapolating our experiment. In an ideal case, we would maybe want to take a full-scale experiment. So we take a slice out of reality, do an experiment on it, see how it works. Very unrealistic if you deal with the Earth. It's very complicated. Dynamic scaling is something that engineers really like. This is scaling using dimensionless numbers. So you match your experiments to the prototype, and if the two dimensionless number sets are identical, you could maybe completely dynamically scale or almost. The other extreme would be just exploratory experiments. These are fun. You just run a bunch and you see what happens. Very hard to extrapolate. Now, our experiments fall into this category here, where it's basically called an inferred scale independence. Why is that the case? When we look at our very first slide of semi-brittle deformation on a micro scale, all the way up to the kilometer scale, our experiments would fall within this range. And if we would assume that, well, if we find the same type of deformations over a multiple time scale, and our experiments are falling within this range, that the physics that governs this range of examples is essentially, hopefully, the same in the experiment as it is over the range of examples in nature. Now, this might still be somewhat unsatisfactory for some folks, and this is another project that we currently is ongoing, where we are in the process of developing numerical models that can combine the breaking of individual class within a fluid, so that we can actually extrapolate these things a little bit better to nature. So what the plan is for this is that we're using our experimental findings in the lab to benchmark the numerical solution, and then use the numerical models, feed some equations coming from rock physics into the models to extrapolate it to nature. This is again something that is not quite up and running at the moment. So this is something we should have maybe another chat in, I don't know, 5 years or so, to see how this entire thing is going. So, to conclude, we set out to answer this question. So, can semi-brittle deformation be tied to the transition between stick slip and creep? There's a lot of different stuff we visited in between. So we saw, for example, that the presence of a fluid phase has a direct impact on the slip dynamics, that it matters for how deformation localizes, how forces are distributed, that fluids really mess with this force distribution problem. So I'm really sorry to have to say, I can't give you a definite yes or no to the answer, but all these three things have a direct impact on the stability of any fault zone. And therefore, I do think it is quite likely that semi-brittle deformation does play a quite important role when it comes to understanding the stability or the dynamics of the motion of any kind of fault zone. So I hope nobody's too disappointed with this somewhat vague final sentence. If so, I'm sorry, but I hope this is gonna make you feel better. Some uplifting pictures from my lab. I do thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. Was that the appropriate length?
That was perfect.
Thank you. Very interesting too. Very inspiring. I guess we'll start with questions from the audience and then see about questions in the chat. And then we'll go back and forth a little bit as much time we have. So do we have any questions from the physically present audience at this point? Okay, Peter.
Thank you for the excellent talk. I totally enjoyed it. I have many questions, but I will start with just one. And if I have time, I guess I can ask you further. I want to hear a little bit more of your insight about the scaling that you ended. Have you calculated some dimensionless numbers or some material properties just to make sure it has some relevance or some aspects that are very concerning? Either way, I just hear more about that aspect.
No, definitely. So for example, I mean, we know the viscosities, we know yield stresses, we know all these things of the materials we're dealing with in the lab. Where it becomes a problem is with the time scaling, because the phenomena we're observing in nature are really fast. The earthquakes are seconds, super fast, all the way to creep that's on a completely different time scale. And this is something that's really, really hard to capture in lab experiments, where you have to go from something that's extremely fast to something that's very, very slow. And so the experiments certainly break down when it comes to scaling of the time. So that is, I think, I don't know how to do that in a manner that would capture this huge range. We have a pretty good understanding, and I mean, however, plays directly into how you scale viscosities, for example. As soon as you're nonlinear, it is going to matter. So for the brittle parts, I feel fairly confident. For the mixtures, a bit less. Yeah. But any insight on this topic, I'm very interested.
Sorry, are there any questions online? Okay. Along the question of scaling, I know we talked about the viscous dominated versus inertia dominated, but I have a different question. When you showed the curve where you had force, essentially force versus time, from your experiments, and clearly you weren't in like a place where, you know, it was still, the force was still increasing with time. Eventually you would reach a steady state of forcing on the fluid particle mixture. So you're sort of like, you have this constant velocity increasing of force, and it doesn't get there, right? And I'm just, am I getting that wrong?
No.
Okay. And then is it also true that you would expect in nature you're not ever getting to that point where the force plateaus?
So I think first to the experiments. The two different experimental setups have their own issues. So the one that's a tabletop setup has the problem that it basically is a rectangle that is going to be sheared. So it means that two of the corners are pinching over time. And because the granular material is going to get trapped, so that's the source of continuous increasing force. So in these experiments, the force will always keep increasing in the experiment simply because of the setup that is not perfect and can't avoid that specific problem. In the ring shear device, that problem is that it doesn't exist because in this case it's shearing and there is no pinching of anything. In that case, you would expect it to reach a steady state, and we do. So even though you get changes, when you excluding the brittle experiments where you have failure, etc. over time, in everything that has a fluid in it, the forces are gonna reach an equilibrium. Whether you would expect that in nature, I would say probably yes. I'm not quite sure, maybe. If you were to deform it long enough in a similar situation, then I would say yes.
So I think that would mean that.
The answer is yes. I think it lends support for you saying that there's some dynamic similarity. Whereas if you have in one case sort of an increasing force, that might be contributing to the brittle failures of the little particles in a different way than if it's at steady state. And that was why I was wondering about that.
I agree. However, in the experiments where we have this problem with the pinching corner, none of the grains are failing. So yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that was one of the parts why we switched to a ring shear, so we can actually get rid of some of these geometric problems that we had on the table. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thank you.
Very nice. Look, I apologize, I arrived a little late. How much I suppose when you have the beads and the fluid, you keep the fluid under pressure a little bit. How sensitive is the photolightning effect to the pressure that you keep the fluids on?
So these experiments with the photoelastic are also done on this desktop setup, where the only forces are basically those that are coming from the shear motion. So there is no lid on top. So
there is no lid.
No, there's no lid. So the one thing is your experiment need to be fast enough so you're not losing all the fluid. But because it's a pretty high viscosity fluid, that gives you multiple hours to deal with it without it being moving too much out just because of gravity. So it has no lid, so it has no force from the top. It has, of course, gravitational forces, but they're so tiny. So all the actual forces are coming simply from the shearing. But what really plays a big impact is the sensitivity of the photoelastic material. So how stiff the plastic is. And to counteract that, what you have to do for just the experimental procedure is you basically have to benchmark your different patterns you're getting with the amount of force that these different patterns correspond to. So you have to take one little disc, squish it with a known force. No, this is the pattern it will look, and then you basically calibrate your system this way.
Okay, but in principle, under the same light, you expect the same forces felt by the particle,
yes,
regardless of the fluid.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, other questions from the audience, either online or in person? Okay, so this was just fabulous. Thank you, Jacqueline, for a wonderful talk, for the visit. And I would normally say that you know, if you have questions, you can catch Jacqueline afterwards, but she has to kind of rush out the door. She's driving back home tonight to Iowa, so so you have a very short timeline if you're too shy to ask in front of everybody. I again, like Peter, you said you had a couple of questions. I maybe have a couple more. Do you have any more things you want to ask? You're good for now. Okay. Yeah. And I'll reach out too. It's really beautiful. Okay. So thank you so much for your talk, and let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you all. Thanks.